My son-in-law called my garden worthless weeds and suggested I hire a landscaper to clean up the mess I'd been cultivating for decades. What he dismissed as overgrown chaos was actually a rare plant collection worth over $100,000, featuring specimens that botanical gardens compete to acquire. But let me start from the moment when Marcus first saw my backyard sanctuary and decided that his aesthetic preferences should override 30 years of careful botanical preservation. It was a Saturday morning in late April, when my daughter Sarah brought Marcus to see the house for the first time since they'd gotten engaged. I was in my kitchen, watching through the window as they walked through what I'd come to think of as my life's work. 3 acres of carefully cultivated native plants, heritage varieties, and rare specimens that I'd been collecting, propagating and preserving since I'd moved to this property. To most people, my garden didn't look like much. There were no formal flower beds, no manicured lawns, no geometric arrangements of popular garden center plants. Instead, there were patches of what appeared to be wild growth. Native grasses that grew in natural clumps, wildflowers that bloomed in seemingly random patterns, shrubs that hadn't been pruned into artificial shapes, and trees that had been allowed to grow according to their natural inclinations rather than landscape design principles. I watched Marcus survey my work with the expression of someone encountering a problem that needed immediate correction. He was a successful real estate developer who specialized in luxury residential communities, places where every lawn was identical, every shrub was trimmed to regulation height, and every garden conformed to homeowners association standards. "Sarah," I heard him say as they approached the back porch, "your mother's backyard situation is concerning." Concerning, as if 3 decades of botanical research, plant preservation, and ecological restoration was a problem to be solved rather than an achievement to be appreciated. They came into the kitchen where I was preparing lunch, and Marcus settled into a chair with the confident posture of someone about to offer helpful advice. "Mrs. Henderson," he began, "I couldn't help but notice the condition of your backyard. It's quite overgrown." "It's a native plant garden," I said simply. "I've been developing it for 30 years.
Right, but it looks more like a vacant lot than a garden. All those weeds and uncontrolled growth. It's probably affecting your property value and definitely impacting the neighborhood aesthetic."
Weeds. The word that people use when they don't understand the difference between intentional cultivation and neglect, between ecological diversity and suburban uniformity. Sarah, trying to mediate what she could sense was becoming a tense conversation, jumped in. "Mom, Marcus has a lot of experience with landscaping. He's just trying to be helpful." Trying to be helpful. The phrase that family members use when they want to soften the impact of someone else's criticism, when they're asking you to accept judgment disguised as assistance. "What I'm thinking," Marcus continued, warming to what he clearly saw as a generous offer, "is that I could connect you with some excellent landscaping companies. Clean slate approach, remove all the overgrown vegetation, bring in some quality topsoil, install proper drainage, and then do a professional design with appropriate plantings for your zone." Clean slate approach. Remove all the overgrown vegetation. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized he was proposing to destroy everything I'd spent 3 decades building. "Marcus," I said carefully, "what you're seeing isn't overgrown vegetation. It's a curated collection of native and heritage plants, many of which are quite rare." He laughed, not unkindly, but with the dismissive amusement that comes from someone who thinks they're humoring an eccentric relative. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate that you've been gardening as a hobby, but what's out there isn't really... they're just weeds, mostly. Wild plants that have taken over because they haven't been properly managed. Just weeds. Wild plants that have taken over." He was describing my life's work like it was evidence of neglect, rather than evidence of expertise. Like the carefully maintained ecosystem in my backyard was the result of abandonment, rather than intentional cultivation. "I've been specializing in native plant restoration for 30 years, I said. "What looks uncontrolled to you is actually a very carefully managed ecosystem." "Mom," Sarah said, her voice carrying the tone she'd used since childhood when she thought I was being stubborn about something she didn't understand, "maybe it would be good to get a professional opinion, just to see what options you have." Professional opinion. As if my 30 years of study, research, and hands-on experience didn't qualify as professional knowledge. As if expertise could only be legitimate if it came with a business license and a crew of workers with power tools. "Marcus added, "some of those plants might actually be invasive species." You could be inadvertently damaging the local ecosystem by letting them spread unchecked. Invasive species. He was suggesting that I, someone who had spent decades studying native plant ecology, might be accidentally introducing harmful plants to an environment I'd been working to restore for longer than he'd been living in this state. Marcus, every plant in my garden is either native to this region or a heritage variety that was grown here historically. I don't cultivate invasive species. But how would you know for sure? I mean, without professional training, it's easy to mistake one plant for another. Without professional training. The assumption that because I wasn't employed by a landscaping company, because I didn't have a crew and a business name painted on a truck, I couldn't possibly have the knowledge necessary to identify and cultivate plants appropriately. That evening, after Sarah and Marcus had left with promises to think about my landscaping situation, I walked through my garden in the fading light, looking at it through their eyes and trying to understand how 30 years of careful work could be dismissed so casually. But what I saw wasn't weeds or overgrowth or neglect. What I saw was a collection that represented decades of research, networking with other botanists, careful propagation of rare specimens, and the gradual creation of a habitat that supported local wildlife while preserving plant varieties that were becoming increasingly difficult to find. What Marcus couldn't see, because he'd never learned to look, was that his worthless weeds were actually treasures hiding in plain sight. The next morning, I did something I'd been meaning to do for years. I started documenting my collection systematically. What had begun as a personal passion project had grown into something significant enough that it deserved proper cataloging, and Marcus's dismissive comments had reminded me that expertise isn't always recognized without formal presentation. I began with the heritage tomatoes, varieties that had been grown by families for generations, but had never been commercialized or registered with seed companies. These weren't plants you could buy at garden centers. They were living history, preserved through networks of gardeners who traded seeds and shared growing knowledge. In my greenhouse, I had Cherokee purples from seeds that had been passed down through a family in Tennessee since the 1800s. Brandywines that traced their lineage to an Amish community in Pennsylvania. Mortgage lifters, named because a gardener in the 1930s had paid off his mortgage by selling the enormous tomatoes this variety produced. But the tomatoes were just the beginning. As I moved through my garden with my notebook, camera, and plant identification books, I began to appreciate the scope of what I'd accumulated over 3 decades of careful collecting. Native wildflowers that had been crowded out of most habitats by development and agricultural expansion. Wild ginger that grew naturally in only a few remaining old-growth forest areas. Trout lily that most people had never seen because its natural habitat had been largely destroyed by suburban development. Heritage roses that predated modern hybrid varieties, plants that had grown in American gardens since colonial times, but had been largely abandoned in favor of showier, more uniform modern cultivars. Damask roses that carried scents so complex and beautiful that perfumers still sought out their essential oils. Rugosa roses that had been brought by early settlers and had adapted so well to local conditions that they'd become part of the regional ecosystem. Each plant had a story, and many had taken years to acquire. The wild bergamot had come from seeds shared by a botanist in Minnesota, who was working to preserve prairie plant genetics. The native orchids had been propagated from specimens that were being rescued from a development site. The heritage apple trees had been grafted from wood taken from trees that were being removed from an abandoned homestead. This wasn't casual gardening or accidental accumulation. This was systematic conservation work, the kind of preservation effort that botanical gardens and universities undertook with formal funding and institutional support. The difference was that I'd been doing it in my backyard, without fanfare or recognition, simply because I understood that these plants represented genetic diversity and cultural history that was disappearing from the landscape. But the real revelation came when I started researching the current market value of some of my specimens. The heritage fruit trees alone, varieties that had been thought extinct until I'd managed to locate and propagate them, were worth thousands of dollars each to collectors and institutions working on genetic preservation. The native orchids that Marcus had probably dismissed as weird wild plants were so rare that botanical gardens paid hundreds of dollars for single specimens. The heritage seeds I'd been collecting and sharing freely with other gardeners through informal networks had commercial value that I'd never considered. Seed companies that specialized in heirloom varieties were selling packets of seeds for plants I had growing by the hundreds. By the end of my first week of systematic documentation, I had cataloged over 200 distinct varieties of plants, many of them rare, several of them extremely valuable, and a few of them so uncommon that my specimens might represent the only examples in cultivation outside of major botanical institutions. But I still needed expert validation of what I was seeing, because while I was confident in my plant identification skills and my understanding of what I'd been growing, I realized that Marcus's dismissive attitude might be shared by others who couldn't see the value in a garden that didn't conform to conventional aesthetic standards. I needed someone with formal credentials to confirm what I suspected, that my worthless weeds were actually an extremely valuable botanical collection that deserved recognition and protection. That's when I decided to contact Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the state botanist at the University Extension Service, someone whose professional opinion would carry the weight that my personal expertise apparently didn't. Dr. Elena Rodriguez arrived on a Tuesday morning in early May, driving a university vehicle and carrying the kind of professional equipment that instantly legitimized her presence in ways my decades of experience apparently hadn't. She was a woman in her 50s with the practical clothing and confident manner of someone who spent as much time in the field as in academic offices. I had requested this consultation somewhat nervously, unsure whether my collection would impress a professional botanist or whether I'd been overestimating the significance of my work. Marcus's dismissive comments had shaken my confidence in ways I hadn't expected, making me question whether my passion project had any real value beyond personal satisfaction. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Rodriguez said as we walked toward my backyard, "I have to tell you, your phone call was intriguing. It's unusual to get requests for collection assessments from private individuals, especially collections that have been assembled over decades without institutional support." "I hope I'm not wasting your time," I said. "It's possible I've overestimated what I've been growing here." She stopped walking and looked at me with surprise. "Mrs. Henderson, based on our phone conversation alone, I doubt very much that you've overestimated anything. The plant varieties you mentioned are exactly the kinds of specimens that conservation botanists are desperate to locate and preserve. We started with the native wildflower section, an area that probably looked to most people like an unmowed field, but that contained dozens of species that had once been common throughout the region." Dr. Rodriguez knelt beside a patch of what appeared to be unremarkable flowering plants and immediately began identifying species with the rapid precision of someone who recognized rare treasures. "Wild lupine," she said, making notes on her tablet. "These are becoming extremely uncommon. And is that—" "Yes, that's wild columbine. Mrs. Henderson, how did you manage to establish such a healthy population of wild columbine?" "We've been trying to reintroduce it to state parks for years with very limited success. I collected seeds from the last natural stand I could find, about 15 years ago. It took several years of experimentation to figure out the right growing conditions. But once I established the right soil pH and moisture levels, they began self-seeding." She looked up from her notes. "You've been doing conservation seed collection and propagation work for 15 years? "Actually, for about 25 years. But the Columbine project was particularly challenging." Dr. Rodriguez spent the next 4 hours methodically examining and documenting what she found in my garden. Her excitement grew with each section we explored, and her professional vocabulary shifted from polite interest to genuine amazement. "Mrs. Henderson, this heritage rose collection is extraordinary. Some of these varieties are so rare that I thought they existed only in a few specialized collections. How did you acquire the Rosa gallica specimens?" "Through a network of heritage rose enthusiasts. We trade budwood and share propagation techniques."
And the native orchids?
"Rescue propagation from development sites? Mostly. When construction projects threaten native orchid populations, I've been able to successfully relocate and establish them here." By mid-afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez was making phone calls to colleagues, describing discoveries that clearly exceeded her expectations for a private garden assessment. "Dr. Martinez, Elena, I'm at a private collection that you need to see. The owner has managed to preserve and propagate species that we thought were extinct in this region. No, I'm serious. She has thriving populations of plants that we haven't seen in natural habitats for decades." The conversation that followed established what I had suspected, but hadn't dared to believe. My garden wasn't just a valuable collection, it was a scientifically significant preservation effort that deserved recognition and protection. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Rodriguez said as we finished the survey, "I need you to understand something. What you've created here isn't just a garden, it's a living museum of regional botanical history, a gene bank for rare and heritage varieties, and a successful conservation project that rivals the work being done at major botanical institutions. So it's valuable? Valuable is an understatement. From a scientific perspective, this collection is invaluable. From a monetary perspective, conservative estimates would place the value of your living specimens, seeds, and genetic preservation work at well over $100,000. Marcus's worthless weeds were worth more than most people's annual salaries, more than the luxury landscaping projects he installed in his developments, more than he had probably imagined was possible for plants that didn't conform to his aesthetic standards. But more important than the monetary value, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is the conservation value. Some of these plants exist nowhere else in cultivation. If your collection were lost, we would lose genetic material that took decades to assemble and can't be easily replaced. Dr. Rodriguez, what should I do with this information? First, you should document everything professionally, which I'd like to help you do. Second, you should consider partnering with conservation organizations to ensure this collection is preserved and utilized for its maximum scientific benefit. And third, you should be very proud of what you've accomplished here. That evening, I called Sarah with news that would change how my family understood everything they thought they knew about my hobby gardening, and Marcus's landscaping suggestions. The phone call with Sarah was unlike any conversation we'd had since she'd brought Marcus to see my property. Instead of me defending my garden against suggestions for improvement, I was explaining why his proposed clean slate approach would have destroyed something irreplaceable and scientifically significant. Mom, wait, slow down. You're saying Dr. Rodriguez valued your garden at how much? Over $100,000 conservatively. But Sarah, the monetary value isn't the most important part. She said some of my plants are so rare that they don't exist anywhere else in cultivation. I could hear Sarah processing this information, trying to reconcile the image of her mother's messy backyard with the description of a scientifically significant botanical collection. But Mom, it looks like, to most people, it looks like wild plants and overgrowth. To most people, yes. But to botanists and conservation specialists, it looks like 30 years of systematic preservation work and genetic conservation. And Marcus wanted to remove all the overgrown vegetation and start over with appropriate plantings. Sarah, if I had followed his advice, I would have destroyed plant specimens that can't be replaced, genetic material that represents decades of conservation work, and living examples of species that are disappearing from natural habitats. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she was reconsidering everything she thought she knew about gardening, expertise, and the difference between aesthetic preferences and scientific value. Mom, I need to apologize. For what? For not taking your gardening seriously, for treating it like a hobby instead of recognizing it as, what did you call it? Conservation work. Sarah, you couldn't have known. Most people don't realize that what looks ordinary or even messy might actually be extraordinary if you understand what you're looking at. But you tried to tell us it was a native plant collection, and we didn't listen. You listened to Marcus instead, because he spoke with the confidence of professional expertise, and I spoke with the quiet knowledge of personal passion. The difference is that his expertise is in real estate development and mine is in botanical conservation. 3 days later, Sarah called back with news that Marcus wanted to speak with me directly. Mom, he's pretty embarrassed. When I told him what Dr. Rodriguez said about your collection, he realized that he had basically offered to destroy something irreplaceable. I'd be happy to talk with him. He's also curious about something. He wants to know if there are other gardens like yours that he might have misunderstood when he was evaluating properties for development. Other gardens like mine. The question that opened up a much larger conversation about how many botanical treasures might be hidden in backyards that looked unmaintained to people who didn't understand the difference between neglect and ecological gardening. Marcus called that evening, and the conversation was unlike our first meeting in every possible way. Mrs. Henderson, I owe you a significant apology. I had no idea that what I was looking at was... I had no idea what I was looking at. Marcus, you couldn't have known. Recognizing botanical significance requires specific knowledge that most people don't have. But that's just it. I made assumptions about value based on appearance, without considering that there might be factors I didn't understand. In my business, that kind of mistake can be costly. In botanical conservation, that kind of mistake can be irreversible. Mrs. Henderson, I have a question, and I hope it doesn't sound opportunistic, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to consult on some of my development projects, not for landscaping design but for, I guess, botanical assessment, to help identify if there are existing plants on development sites that might be worth preserving before we clear land. A consulting opportunity. Marcus was offering to pay me for the expertise he'd initially dismissed, recognizing that my knowledge had commercial value in his industry. I'd be interested in that, Marcus. And Mrs. Henderson? Sarah mentioned that Dr. Rodriguez wants to help you document your collection professionally. Would you be open to me funding that documentation project? As an apology for my initial assessment, and as an investment in making sure your work gets the recognition it deserves. 6 months later, the comprehensive documentation of my botanical collection was complete, funded by Marcus and conducted in partnership with the University Extension Service. The resulting catalog became a reference document for conservation botanists throughout the region, and established my garden as an official botanical conservation site. But the real transformation wasn't in the formal recognition. It was in how my family's understanding of my work changed once they realized that expertise doesn't always announce itself with professional credentials, and that 30 years of quiet study can create something more valuable than flashy development projects. 8 months after Marcus had dismissed my garden as worthless weeds, I was standing in the conference room of his development company, presenting a botanical assessment report for a 50-acre residential project that had just received preliminary approval for construction. The site survey had taken 3 weeks and had revealed exactly what I'd suspected. The vacant land that Marcus intended to develop contained one of the last remaining stands of old-growth forest in our county, complete with native plant communities that had been undisturbed for over a century. The economic impact of preserving these natural areas, I explained to the assembled developers, city planners, and environmental consultants, extends far beyond the immediate botanical value. Heritage trail systems, native plant education centers, and ecotourism facilities could generate ongoing revenue while preserving irreplaceable natural resources. Marcus, who 6 months earlier had suggested removing all vegetation from my property to create a clean slate, was now nodding thoughtfully as I outlined how botanical preservation could enhance rather than hinder development profitability. Mrs. Henderson, what would preservation look like practically? How much of the site would need to remain undeveloped? Approximately 40 acres contain the most significant botanical specimens in established ecosystems. But Marcus, those 40 acres could become the centerpiece of the development rather than an obstacle to it. Marketing luxury homes adjacent to preserved old-growth forest and native plant sanctuaries would differentiate this project from every other suburban development in the region. The city planner, who had initially been skeptical about delaying development for botanical assessment, was studying my species inventory with growing interest. Mrs. Henderson, some of these plants you've identified, they're listed as threatened species, aren't they? 7 of the plant species on this site are officially designated as threatened or endangered at the state level. Destroying their habitat would require federal environmental impact assessments and could delay or halt development entirely. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. What had seemed like a straightforward development project had suddenly become complicated by the presence of plants that most of them couldn't identify, but that carried legal protections requiring significant compliance measures. However, I continued, there's an alternative approach. If the development incorporates habitat preservation and creates educational partnerships with local schools and environmental organizations, you could qualify for green development incentives, tax benefits, and marketing advantages that would offset the reduced building density. Marcus was taking notes, calculating numbers, and approaching my botanical findings not as obstacles but as opportunities for innovative development design. Mrs. Henderson, would you be willing to work with our architects to design a development plan that incorporates botanical preservation as a selling point rather than a limitation? 6 months later, the Woodland Heritage Development became the first residential project in our county to receive both National Audubon Society certification for habitat preservation and LEED certification for sustainable community design. The preserved old-growth forest became a community amenity that increased property values by 15% above comparable developments, and the Native Plant Education Center attracted visitors from throughout the region. But the real success was measured in what we'd prevented from being lost. Plant species that existed nowhere else locally continued to thrive in their natural habitat. Educational programs introduced thousands of children to botanical science and conservation principles, A walking trail system allowed residents to experience the kind of natural beauty that had been largely eliminated from suburban landscapes. More importantly, the success of the Woodland Heritage Project changed how Marcus approached every subsequent development. Instead of viewing existing vegetation as obstacles to be removed, he began assessing sites for botanical and ecological value that could be preserved and incorporated into project designs. "Mrs. Henderson," he said during one of our planning meetings, "I have to tell you something. This partnership has made me a better developer, but it's also made me realize how much I didn't understand about the environments I was building in." "How so?" "I was designing communities for people without considering the ecosystems that supported those environments. I was creating landscapes that looked attractive but weren't actually sustainable or ecologically appropriate for their regions." Within a year, our partnership had expanded beyond single development projects to comprehensive consulting work with developers throughout the state. I was no longer just the woman with an interesting backyard garden. I was a professional botanical consultant whose expertise was sought out by companies that had previously hired landscapers to impose generic designs on diverse natural environments. The business, Henderson Botanical Consulting, generated more revenue in its first year than I had earned in the last 5 years of my teaching career. But more satisfying than the financial success was the knowledge that my work was preserving natural habitats and plant species that would have been lost to development without thoughtful intervention. Sarah, who had initially supported Marcus's suggestions for cleaning up my garden, was now helping me manage the administrative aspects of a consulting business that was booked months in advance. "Mom, I have to ask you something." "What's that, dear?" "When Marcus first suggested landscaping your garden, were you hurt that we didn't recognize what you'd built?" I thought about her question, about the moment when they'd dismissed 30 years of my work as weeds that needed professional correction. I wasn't hurt, Sarah. I was determined to prove that knowledge and expertise aren't always visible to people who don't share that specialized understanding. And now I'm grateful that Marcus's mistake led to Dr. Rodriguez's assessment, which led to formal recognition of my work, which led to a second career I never would have imagined at age 73. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to your expertise is having it dismissed by someone who doesn't recognize its value, because the process of proving them wrong often leads to opportunities you never would have pursued if they had simply accepted your competence from the beginning. 2 years after Marcus had called my garden worthless weeds, I was standing in front of the state legislature's environmental committee, testifying in support of legislation that would provide tax incentives for property owners who maintained native plant habitats and heritage botanical collections on private land. The proposed Native Plant Preservation Act had grown out of documentation work that began with my own collection, but had expanded to identify hundreds of similar preservation efforts throughout the state. Retired teachers maintaining heritage vegetable gardens, elderly farmers preserving heirloom grain varieties, suburban gardeners cultivating native wildflower meadows that supported declining pollinator populations. "What we've discovered," I told the legislators, "is that some of our most significant botanical conservation work is happening in backyards and small private spaces, carried out by individuals who have been preserving genetic diversity and native species without any institutional support or recognition." The legislation would change that by creating a registry of certified private conservation sites, providing property tax reductions for verified habitat preservation, and establishing grants for documentation and educational programming related to private botanical collections. "Mrs. Henderson," asked Representative Martinez, "how many privately maintained collections do you estimate would qualify for this type of recognition?" "Based on our preliminary survey work, we've identified over 300 properties in our state alone that maintain significant native plant or heritage variety collections. The economic value of the genetic preservation work being done on these private properties exceeds $2 million, and the educational and research value is immeasurable. $2 million worth of conservation work being done by people whose expertise had often been overlooked or dismissed because it didn't come with institutional credentials or professional landscaping licenses. The Native Plant Preservation Act passed 6 months later with unanimous support from both parties, unusual agreement that reflected the broad appeal of legislation that supported both environmental conservation and property owner rights, while recognizing the contributions of citizen scientists throughout the state. But the real measure of change wasn't in the legislative success. It was in the phone calls I received from people who had heard about my work and wanted to know if their own gardens might have scientific or conservation value. Eleanor, a 90-year-old woman in rural Oregon who had been saving and replanting heritage bean varieties that her grandmother had brought from Italy, and her hobby gardening turned out to include the only remaining examples of several European heirloom varieties that had been thought extinct. Robert, a retired engineer who had spent 20 years cultivating native prairie grasses on his suburban property. His unmaintained yard contained seed sources for prairie restoration projects throughout the Midwest. Margaret, whose weedy herb garden included medicinal plants that had been used by indigenous communities for centuries and that pharmaceutical researchers were trying to study for modern applications. Each of these discoveries reinforced the same lesson. Botanical expertise and conservation value aren't always visible to casual observers, and some of our most important preservation work is being done quietly by people whose knowledge has been accumulated through decades of patient study rather than formal academic training. Henderson Botanical Consulting had grown to employ 6 people, including Sarah as business manager and Marcus as project development coordinator. We were working with developers in 4 states, had partnered with 3 universities on conservation research projects, and had been featured in national publications as an example of how private expertise could contribute to professional conservation efforts. But the work that made me proudest was the educational programming we'd developed for schools and community groups. Children who had never seen native wildflowers or heritage vegetables were learning to identify plant species, understand ecological relationships, and appreciate the botanical diversity that surrounded them in ways their parents had never been taught to see. "Mrs. Henderson," said Dr. Rodriguez during one of our quarterly project meetings, "I need to tell you something. The work you've done, starting with defending your own garden and expanding to statewide conservation policy, has changed how the botanical community thinks about citizen science and private conservation efforts." "How so?" "We used to think that significant conservation work required institutional funding, academic oversight, and professional credentials. What you've demonstrated is that some of our most important preservation efforts are happening in private spaces, carried out by people whose expertise developed through personal passion rather than formal training." 6 months later, I received a call that marked the ultimate transformation of my relationship with the botanical community. The State Botanical Garden was offering me a position as Director of Community Conservation Programs, a newly created role that would coordinate partnerships between private collectors, citizen scientists, and professional botanical institutions throughout the region. At age 75, I was being offered my first official academic appointment, not despite my lack of formal credentials, but because of the practical expertise I'd developed through 3 decades of independent study and conservation work. "Dr. Henderson," the garden director said during our meeting, "they had awarded me an honorary doctorate in recognition of my contributions to botanical conservation. We'd like you to develop a program that identifies, supports, and coordinates the citizen science work that's happening in private gardens throughout our region." Dr. Henderson, the title I'd never pursued through traditional academic channels, but had earned through the recognition that expertise can be demonstrated through results rather than just credentials. My son-in-law had called my garden worthless weeds and suggested professional intervention to clean up what he saw as neglect and overgrowth. What he'd actually been looking at was the foundation of a second career that would contribute more to botanical conservation than anything I'd accomplished in my first profession. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is ignore other people's assessment of your work and continue developing expertise in areas that matter to you, because the people who dismiss your efforts often don't have the knowledge necessary to recognize their significance. This was my truth. And it began with 30 years of patient work that looked like nothing special to casual observers, but turned out to be extraordinary when viewed by people who understood what they were seeing. If you've ever been told that your interests are worthless, your hobbies are meaningless, or your expertise isn't legitimate because it doesn't come with official recognition, remember that the most important conservation work often happens quietly in spaces that don't look impressive to people who don't understand their value. Sometimes weeds are just weeds, but sometimes they're treasures that are waiting for someone with the right knowledge to recognize their worth.